Hi, this is Shep Altschuler, publisher of TimeSharing Today. Welcome to this broadcast of TimeSharing Today Radio, featuring news and views of owners and industry professionals. Today we're being joined by CPAs Lena Combs and Tom Durkee with the highly respected Orlando-based auditing firm Averett, Warmus, and Durkee. During the broadcast, they will explain many of the key items contained in the annual audits they prepare for timeshare HOAs and their management. It's also important for owners to take the time and analyze those statements and to understand the importance of the items that we will be discussing. Hi, Lena and Tom. Welcome to the broadcast.
Hi, Shep. Thanks for having us.
That's my pleasure. Now, Tom, why don't you spend a few minutes talking about your firm, Averett, Warmus, Durkee, and where you're located and the services that you provide?
Hi, Shep. Thank you. Our firm is based in Central Florida, and we are a large firm for our area. We have about 120 folks. About 90 or so of those are professionals. Most of those are CPAs. And one of our niches, among several, is the timeshare industry services that we provide. And we have a core group that's dedicated to serving that industry that Lena and I lead, and it's a big part of what we do and has been since the inception of the firm back in 1989.
And Lena, are these associations that you're providing services to, are they mixed in terms of size, or are you specializing in any specific type of HOA or resort?
Yeah, Chef. They're definitely different in size and complexity, location. We certainly do a lot of the associations in Florida, but a preponderance of the timeshare resorts in the country are in Florida. We have clients that are associations and managers based all over the country. So we get to see a lot of different types of activities and what's going on in other parts of the country, which we find is pretty similar to what's happening here in our own backyard, as well as various beach properties, inland properties, ski properties. So we have a pretty good cross-section of what's represented in the resort industry itself.
Now, you have presented at several of our meetings your benchmark statistics. Maybe you could do a quick summary, Lena, of what those studies entail and what's the significance of them.
Right, we'd be happy to. So annually we do a study where we get 100 associations in Florida. We get their audited financial statements and their budgets. We accumulate all the financial data that we can in a fashion that makes it comparable. And then we summarize that data and try to present or analyze what the trends that we're seeing are over a multi-year period. So right now we're working on our 11th year of data. So we have 11 years showing what the trends are in these associations and try to do some benchmarking and provide some tools for associations to sort of benchmark themselves. How are we doing? Where are our assessment levels in comparison to what's in the study? What are the bad debt trends that are being seen? And sort of to give resorts and resort managers and boards a tool to help themselves gauge their own financial performance, of course, considering their own individual circumstances.
Since we're significantly well through 2014, and your studies, I guess the last one was a 2013 study?
Yes, and we are currently working on the 2014 report, which should be ready in a month or so.
I see. So could you just talk about a couple of key indicators or trends that you have seen be of interest to owners when they receive their financial statements from their resorts? And also, what should board members and resort managers be aware of some of these key trends that you see?
Some of the things that we've seen, notably the things that we've reported on, are the sort of stability of delinquencies. Not that collections levels are getting significantly better, but we've seen sort of a halt to the decline, which we think is fairly significant. We think that's a pretty good indicator, and especially, hopefully, as some of this association and inventory gets turned into performing units, we can start to see those collections percentages come back up. That's what we're hoping to see with this year's study. But that's certainly one of the key factors. Everybody wants to know about collections and bad debts. Another one of the key factors we've seen is the number of associations who are using their collections at the end of the year for next year's assessments to pay this year's bills. Because most resorts will bill in, maybe September or October, as early as that. A lot of times November, but they'll start collecting all that money, and they'll spend a good portion of it even before the end of the year, and that money is really to pay the next year's bills. We've seen that percentage come down, but on average, we're seeing about 50% of the associations in our study using next year's money to pay this year's expenses, and we think that that's a problem. Although it's down from 60%, we think that those numbers should hopefully come down, and that more realistic budgeting and the stabilization of bad debt should play a key factor in that.
Tom, owners are always concerned about increases in maintenance fees, and especially when they get hit with special assessments that they seem to be ill-prepared to hear about, or certainly not welcome when they get the news about it. And is there anything that owners should be looking at, and maybe give them some tips on understanding the financials? What is it that they should glean from the financials relative to the health of the association and the need for maintenance fee increases and possibly special assessments?
Sure, Shep, absolutely. I think one of the things that is unfortunate in the industry is that folks perceive static maintenance fees with a positive situation in terms of their investment in their particular timeshare unit. Our experience with a couple of troubled resort task force activities has been that once an association gets so far gone in terms of its financial health, it's almost impossible for the owners themselves to bail it out, because once it's undesirable, it's very difficult to recover, and that board has a difficult time generating revenue from rentals, has a difficult time generating resales, has a difficult time, more so than normal, with bad debts also. And so what we see or have seen in these troubled resort activities is boards that are comprised of oftentimes the same people that have been on the board for many, many years, and then they turn around and they are dealing with a bad debt situation, and they're dealing with a situation where they can't supplement that bad debt with ancillary revenues. They have more trouble than most people with finding new owners to want to be part of their timeshare regime. Many of them can't get to the point where they don't want their own units anymore, and really have no choice in the matter. So I would tell owners that have a static maintenance fee to watch out, because a lot of times all that is putting off to tomorrow what really should be done today. And we've seen too many of these situations now that the industry is showing some age. So that's number one. Number two is special assessments come from two things generally. One are operating issues, and one are capital issues. And the capital issues result in special assessments oftentimes because reserves aren't properly being funded, and they're not properly being funded many times because assessments are staying static when they really should be probably increasing at least by the cost of living every year in order to maintain their status quo and their financial stability. So capital reserves being underfunded is a huge problem. That's the first place people go to get money when they need it. In fact, our study, and I don't have it in front of me, but Leni can maybe speak to it later, but our study shows a large large percentage of associations borrowing from the reserve fund to finance its operations, which we think is just a Band-Aid. So we have those issues with the capital funding side of the business, and then the operating side of the business really is a matter of liquidity and positive equity. These the business plans for these associations aren't designed to accumulate large amounts of fund balance in the operating fund, but they do need to have enough fund balance to maintain liquidity without having to borrow from its reserve fund, and ideally without having to borrow from anybody, including commercial banks, etc. So what Lena mentioned in the last segment about these many associations borrowing from next year's assessments essentially to finance this year's operations can be done, and the average owner that sees his maintenance fee staying the same or maybe going up a little bit may be completely oblivious to this condition. But what they should be looking at before they buy and while they're an owner is whether or not there's positive fund balance and typically positive results of operations in the operating fund, because if they're having negative fund balance and or negative operating results in the years that they're an owner, and their assessments are not going up to fund those, it's very likely kind of a ticking time bomb. Interestingly, just this last week, we were working on some audits and reading the minutes of the board meetings, and management was in the board meetings talking about what great shape the associations were in and how positive things were and so forth. And we're sitting in our offices now working on the audits for those very same years with some real concerns about whether they need to be given a going concern opinion or not. And so I just think there's no substitute for paying attention and being aware of these things that we've just talked about.
Lena, Tom mentioned board members sitting on a board for decades. There may not necessarily be a problem associated with long-term service, but there might be other issues, especially when the resort is running into certain financial challenges, as Tom pointed out. Could you speak to that in some context of board members maybe having a hidden agenda or not fully complying for one reason or another? Is that within your purview of experience to comment on that?
It is. I think, very briefly, what we see is that board members don't always completely understand the depth of their fiduciary responsibility. And a lot of them seem to be more concerned with the stability of maintenance fee assessments to not anger the owner base, to try to be sympathetic to their individual economic circumstances to the detriment of the association, waiving reserves or not funding reserves, not raising assessments and being realistic about their collections percentages is really just deferring the inevitable. Something will eventually happen. Board members staying on for the long term, it's like keeping your auditors for the long term. Sometimes that's a good thing. You have institutional knowledge, but they have to be engaged in the process and be doing what's best for the association. So just because no change occurs does not necessarily make it a detriment. It's the nature of the engagement and the service to the association itself.
It's pretty common knowledge about the increasing unsold inventory that's been taken back and controlled by the various HOAs. And some of that inventory may be a significant contributor to non-revenue generating inventory. And how significant is that from your perspective in terms of the shortfalls in operating funds and shortfalls in reserves?
We've seen over the period of our study, we've certainly seen an increase, a significant increase in inventory that's being owned by the associations. Now, that's not to say that inventory cannot generate the same amount of revenue as a maintenance assessment. Probably not, but it could be rented if every single unit was rented. But it's always going to be more beneficial to the association to have a paying owner in that weekly interval, obviously, because you're going to get made whole. You have to fund reserves out of, let's say the association owns a week, and you rent it for $500, and the maintenance assessment is $700. But you still have to fund the reserves and pay real estate taxes on it. So there's still costs that are being incurred, and it's one of the largest issues is these associations finding a mechanism to turn this delinquent inventory that they've come into possession of into performing units. And I think that's the crux of what we had spoken about before. But I also think that as the association owns inventory, it possibly can demoralize other owners, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the ability to turn it around, resell it, have paying owners, just creates a better situation for everyone.
Tom, there's a correlation from my mind to reserve studies, reserve funding, refurbishing, and maintenance fees and special assessments. So from the auditing perspective, when resorts seem to be moving in a healthy direction, how do you explain the correlation between all those different factors? Does that question make sense?
It does, Shep, because they're all related, and all those factors are part of what management's supposed to be doing when they propose a budget for the board to adopt. The board and management are trying to balance owner perception about the gross amount of the management fees and the increases of the fluctuations from prior years, along with what management is telling them that they need to do fiscally. Also, a lot of management companies get fired for in the boards or the members' view, raising assessments too high or too quickly. So anything that's negative, like the special assessments you've spoken of, and the problems that we've seen, really reflect poorly on everybody. It's just way better to do this stuff incrementally and not create a hole that has to be dug out of. So I guess your question was, how do all these factors relate to each other? And they relate to each other because it's the same owner paying one bill in their view. If you ask an owner, how much are your maintenance fees, they say $600 or $700. They don't say, well, it's $500, but $150 is going into a savings account for reserves. They perceive it all as one thing, and the capital budgeting that goes on within the association is not real transparent to them. So I think a lot of education in that regard, would be helpful to those that want to be involved in their boards. But they are related because bad debts affect the operating fund. The operating fund doesn't have enough money, then sometimes, even though they shouldn't, they borrow from the reserve fund. When cash gets tight, reserve projects get put off, and there could be deferred maintenance that needs to be reserved for that's not part of the mandatory items that are required to be reserved for in some states that aren't being reserved for, that would or could be if there wasn't so much sensitivity to the increased assessments that are necessary on the operating side to fund those deficits. And so it really is all related, and I know I've kind of talked around this, but it's related because to the owners, I think they get one bill, and that's how they evaluate the value proposition. And with respect to this ancillary activity that's there to replace assessments on units that aren't paying or that are non-performing or that the HOA owns, those are all good things. But again, I believe that those sort of mask a deeper problem because the HOA ultimately doesn't want to be a hotel. They want to be a membership organization where people use the product because they want that product, not an organization that's competing for room nights on an internet site with every hotel in the business that's professionally managed and has professional marketing for those types of activities.
Yeah, we know that the challenge is if you're not generating new buyers and the resort doesn't have eye appeal to younger families and the amenities don't line up with their expectations. Simple example is guests wanting free Wi-Fi. So if you have to either sell a timeshare or rent the timeshare in order to generate revenues. So the resorts are seeing that there's a lack of new buyers coming in many cases. So the unsold inventory is piling up because of owner attrition or just the fact that they just can't afford to travel or visit the resort. So they're in this catch-22 situation. So they really rely on trying to find renters and not really putting the emphasis on sales. And you see a trend in that area?
Absolutely, because people are wrestling with, okay, we've got the first thing that happens is somebody quits paying or gives up their unit. So the first thought is, how can we replace that revenue? Because we got a deficit. If we don't replace the revenue, everybody else has to pay. And that creates a spiral. I think, not to muddy the situation, but this points-based ownership population that we are going to now, I think, exacerbates the problem because people view those points simply as currency. A lot of times, we know many owners that never use their home resort. All they use it for is exchange privileges, and they essentially shop for resorts that has the highest exchange currency per dollar, on the market, and that's what they buy. And so this flexibility that we are seeing in the marketplace with respect to that, it comes at a cost, and the cost of that is pride of ownership in a home resort, which is at the core of why people give up their units other than, financial stress. And so this idea of somebody not paying and a membership base which has less pride of ownership in their home resort and is extremely sensitive to an increase in their assessments causes management to say, what can we do to replace the revenue? It's completely different than, let's say, a country club setting where it's a membership organization and those people want to be a member of the club, and when those clubs get in trouble, they say, what can we do to increase our membership? Where can we find people that would like this experience? And I think it eventually can be extremely damaging to associations as they run through their lifespan, and if they are out from under a caring developer for a lifespan, rent certainly fills the coffers if you can get it. Let's say as these units are becoming non-performing, but then you have to rent it again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. And I just think, there's a lot of competition out there. Many of these properties are not under the umbrella of a developer, and so they're competing not just with the hotels, they're competing with other really sophisticated marketers of rental nights that are really big in that industry. They have huge reservation bases, the Marriotts, Diamonds, those kind of people. And so if you're a standalone and you're trying to rent your unit to save your budget, or rent your units to save your budget, it's extremely difficult, and you got to keep doing it. And so I really think that the longer I do this, that's the ultimate challenge for turned over associations.
Yeah, and that's the path that they are moving down simply because of the inability to convert exchangers and renters into long-term owners. That's why alternate products and unfortunately the deeded property has some stigma attached to it, and which has led to the success of some of these fraudulent scam operations, convincing owners that they're going to be burdened, beyond eternity with the obligations to pay.
Well,
yep.
you can't envision a situation where a product on the secondary market has, a value that's so much less than many people paid for their product, where it could survive without an active developer. Very unusual, I think, don't you?
I think the challenges are there, but through TBMA, we are seeing some forward-thinking ideas. We have to adapt to changing market conditions, and they have to have an understanding who the new buyers of the future are going to be. What are they looking for in terms of amenities, and what kind of products will they be looking to own? I say you can go in and lease a $65,000 car for 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years, and perhaps timeshares are going to be marketed more, will be more prevalent on that kind of an arrangement because it offers some level of flexibility. And but I want to get back to the financial side. Maybe Lena can just deal with this. When an owner and even a board member is looking at the financial statements, it's possible they don't thoroughly comprehend those financial statements. And is there specific information that can't be found or gleaned from just looking at financial statements?
I think the financial statements are a great tool to give an overall picture of the association's financial health. And that's, the financial statements themselves, the audit, is to give an opinion about whether or not those statements are materially correct, not necessarily be an all-encompassing management tool. But they are a very important part of it. Your budget to actual results, in conjunction with your audited financial statements, in conjunction with delinquency and collections reports, inventory status reports, and sales reports if there's an active sales program, all of that taken together comes into play in really evaluating the financial situation of an individual association on a day-to-day, month-to-month management type basis. But the audited financial statements at the end of the year are certainly a good snapshot of where you stand, and it can tell you a lot of things that can lead to more probing questions. One is, did we spend next year's money before the end of the year? That's very easy to see. Did we spend money out of the reserve fund in order to pay for operating expenses? Again, you can pick that up in about 5 seconds of looking at the financial statements. But part of that is also getting the education to the board members and the managers from their CPAs. Talk to them to say, these are the important things we think. There's lots of important things and words and numbers in the financial statements, but these are some of the key things that we think you should be looking at. If you only had 10 minutes to do it, what would be the list of things that we think you should do? And some education about understanding them.
Let's talk a bit about bankruptcies. There's been reports of management companies and some HOAs in recent months filing for Chapter 11. I think there's one that's gone Chapter 7. What do you see about that as a trend? Tom, do you want to take care of that one?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the maturation of the industry for some of these properties that, as I was talking about before, they've gotten beyond the turnover. They've gotten beyond an active developer at their property. They've gotten beyond active resales, and the generation of those initial generation owners, those folks that have owned for 25 years, 20 years, or at least the timeshare plans are 20 or 25 years old, are the ones that we're seeing issues with, and we're seeing issues with them for a lot of reasons. Often what they've got to sell, the physical structure itself is old, and we talked just a minute ago about the reserve funds and the sufficiency of the reserves. And certainly the reserves have been sufficient to replace things, but have they really been thinking about the perpetuity of their buildings and the quality quality of them in the way an owner would, in the way an owner of a home would, of a residence. And in many cases, they haven't been. They've been thinking about them in terms of, really maintenance, maintaining what they have, replacing things. But what some of these associations are finding they have on their hands is the need to modernize, update. When they make significant changes, they've got to conform to current codes, which is extremely expensive. We had one that we were involved with on a volunteer basis where there was a strong sentiment to consider, on the part of those of us that were trying to help these folks, to consider recommending that they simply combine their owner base with somebody else's and sell one of the properties and take the money and use that to compensate some of the owners that didn't want to continue the plan, or put it into reserves for the future. So I see a huge challenge for some of these associations that you mentioned, Shep, and the biggest reason for that challenge is that if they're not ready for today, it's going to be really hard for them to, make enough hay to catch up with what they really need to do.
I have a question on going concern. Lena, maybe explain what that is, and also where does that appear in the financial statement when it does appear?
Well, financial statements are prepared on the basis of a business continuing as a going concern for a period of time. And one of the jobs of an auditor is to evaluate whether or not there are some circumstances that would cause them to believe that a company could not remain as a going concern or as a functioning operating business, able to pay their bills as they come due for a period of time, typically 12 months, but also further looking than that in some regard. So that, if the auditors make that determination that there is some doubt about an association's ability to continue as a going concern, then they modify the audit opinion, or has kind of an emphasis that is written into the audit opinion, which is in the very front of the financial statement. So that's where an owner could very easily look to see whether or not the auditors have said, we think that there is some doubt about the ability for this business, this association, to keep operating for some period of time.
And Lena, this has been very informative, and if any of our listeners would like to get in touch with AWD, how do they go about doing that?
Thanks, Shep. We can always be called, Tom or I, at 407-849-1569. Also email to lcombs, C-O-M-B-S, at awd-cpa.com, or for Tom, T. Durkee, D-U-R-K-E-E, at awd-cpa.com. For more information about our firm, our website is www.awd-cpa.com.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your taking the time to join us today. And this concludes this broadcast of TimeSharing Today Radio. Your views, experiences, and